YouTube channel. Welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Fall Series. I'm Gregory McNiff, the host of the World War II Discussion Forum. Thrilled to have you here. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking the question. We'll take about 15 or 20 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a fully functioning YouTube channel. I've been uploading all the talks from the fall semester onto it. Please see the icon at the top of the website to access it. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback to the website at www.iidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, someone I'm thrilled to have, who I reached out to a while ago. Tim Bouverie is the critically acclaimed author of Appeasement, which was the New York Times editor's pick and shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. He studied history at Christ Church, Oxford, and was the Alistair Horn Fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He lives in London. This afternoon, he's going to speak about his recent book, Allies at War, How the Struggle Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War and the World, which invite readers into the rooms where the critical decisions were made and goes beyond the confines of the Grand Alliance to examine, among other topics, the doomed Anglo-French partnership, the fractious relationship with Charles de Gaulle and the Free French, and interactions with Poland, Greece, Spain, and neutral Ireland, Yugoslavia, and nationalist China. I don't think it's no shock for anyone to say that the reviews for the book have been stellar. It almost reads like a who's who of who you want to speak. They include Richard Evans, who writes, "This is a compelling and highly readable book." James Holland notes, "This is an astonishing piece of scholarship and one that could not be more timely, superb." And Anthony Beaver writes, "A grand sweep of history, a brilliant narrative." We're thrilled to have Tim, and with that, I will turn it over to him and manage the slides.
Thank you, Greg, very much for inviting me in for that warm and kind introduction. And thank you all very much for joining this afternoon. I'm actually about to fly to America in a week's time to do a 3-week book tour. So it's a shame that this couldn't be in person, but for all I know, you all may be in very different states, indeed in different time zones. So maybe online was the only way to do this, even if I had been on the other side of the Atlantic. First slide, please, Greg. I hope you don't mind. Greg is kindly doing the slides. Why do we need another book on the Second World War? It is, as this discussion group knows better than anyone else, the most chronicled conflict in history. Thousands upon thousands of books exist on almost every aspect of the war. Well, the first thing to say is that this is not a military history, or indeed a biographical approach, a biography of the main Allied war leaders, but a diplomatic and political history of the alliances that triumphed over the Axis. And I stress the word alliances rather than alliance, because there were many. Although the big three, the British Empire, the United States, and the Soviet Union, are naturally at the center of the story, they were not the only set of relationships that existed, or the only set of relationships that mattered. And therefore, one of the primary ambitions I had in setting out on this book was to write a complete history of anti-Axis politics and diplomacy. And so the first part of the book, the first 5 chapters indeed, deals with the doomed Anglo-French alliance of 1939 to 1940. This was, after all, the alliance which was meant to win the Second World War, while subsequent sections include relations with General de Gaulle and the Free French, Allied diplomacy with important neutrals such as Francoist Spain, Ireland, and Sphinx-like Turkey, British intervention in Greece in 1941 and 1944, interventions that were overwhelmingly political in character, the Iraqi revolt of May 1941, and the subsequent 6-week war the British and the Gaullists fought against the Vichy French in Syria and Lebanon. British colonial policy in the Far East following the Japanese onslaught, and Allied interactions with war-torn Yugoslavia, liberated Italy, and occupied Poland. Finally, I wanted to include that vast, complex, and yet so frequently neglected, so frequently neglected major ally, nationalist China. So if I could sum it up in one way, ambition one was to broaden the story. It was breadth. But I also wanted to have an element of, or hopefully a new element of depth, which is to dig below the level of the big three, to go through the archives of the envoys, the ambassadors, the attaches, the war correspondents, the translators, the civil servants who advised the principal decision makers, who commented on their actions, who observed them at the principal conferences, and almost all of whom of which left fascinating records in the form of diaries, memoirs, dispatches, journalism. And I think that by going through over 100 different sets of private papers in Britain and in the United States, I was able to find material which complicates an otherwise familiar story. And I think that is what we as historians are in the business of doing if we are not writing about something that has never been written about before. The justification for a new work on a familiar subject is to complicate or refute accepted narratives. Next slide, please. Why didn't the Axis win the Second World War? The only reason, at its most fundamental, why Hitler, Mussolini, and the militarist governments of Emperor Mikinomyo Hirohito did not triumph between 1939 and 1945 was because they were confronted by a superior coalition of nations and empires that combined their resources and coordinated their plans in order to thwart them. Now, that may sound simple, and we are so used to this image of the Grand Alliance, the big three at Tehran and later at Yalta, that it can almost seem axiomatic, but it certainly wasn't. There was nothing inevitable about the anti-Axis alliance, and there was nothing inevitable about its endurance. In order to bring its economic and demographic weight to bear, the anti-Axis alliance had to be formed and then maintained despite profound differences in ideology, ethics, personality, political systems, and post-war aims, as well as disagreements over strategy, diplomacy, finance, imperialism, the allocation of resources, and the future peace. The anti-Axis coalition was undoubtedly sophisticated, mighty, and conquering. Yet it was also fractious, suspicious, duplicitous, and rivalrous. And it is that antagonism that I really set out to explore in the book, the conflict as well as the cooperation within the alliance for all its consequences, both for the war itself and for the 20th century. The Grand Alliance, and indeed its more minor manifestations, was improbable and incongruous. No one could have predicted it at the start of the war. In September 1939, the Soviet Union was the ally of Nazi Germany, while President Roosevelt, reflecting the views of the vast majority of US citizens, proclaimed US neutrality. Next slide, please. The alliance which was meant to win the war was, of course, the Anglo-French alliance. This was the alliance which had held the Germans in the West for 4 years during World War I, and nobody, including Adolf Hitler, expected the French army to collapse in a mere 6 weeks. Next slide, please. Of course, as we know, it did collapse, And it is only because of this collapse that what comes to be known as the Grand Alliance, in Churchill's phrase, becomes possible. If someone were to ask me what is the most defining event of the 20th century, I would say it is the fall of France. It is the fall of France that makes everything else possible, and possible arguably even for the better, for the forces who cherish democracy and wish to see Nazism crushed, in that it helped propel Hitler towards the Soviet Union, and it helped bring America more closely into the Allied camp. The fall of France quite simply changed everything. Before that, most Americans felt that the British and the French, while not in any way going to have an easy time of it, would probably prevail. But the loss of Britain's only major ally changed all previous calculations. The British may be able to hold the Germans off, wrote the US military attaché in London in September 1940, but they can't beat the Germans without an ally. It must be God Almighty, or it must be the United States. And Churchill realized this. Churchill's strategy, from the moment it was clear that France was going out of the war, was twofold. Step one was simply to survive. As he told the defeatist French commander-in-chief, General Weygand, when the latter asked him at the penultimate conference between the British and the French chiefs of staff in France at Briare on the 11th of June 1940, how the British were going to deal with the 40 or so German divisions poised to cross the Channel, Churchill replied that he was no military expert, but that his military advisers were of the opinion that the best method was to drown as many as possible on the way over and knock the others on the head, frapper sur la tête, as they crawled ashore. Survival at all costs. How to win the war, how to maintain survival beyond the immediate thwarting of an invasion attempt was equally simple, but in fact profoundly difficult to achieve. During the Battle of France, Churchill's son, Randolph, interrupted his father shaving. Churchill growled, "I think I can see my way through. I shall drag in the United States." This, however, as I'm sure this discussion group is extremely aware, was easier said than done. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There was, in 1939 and 1940, widespread antipathy towards entering the war, and indeed a significant quarter of opinion that was hostile to Britain and her supposed war aims. As the British ambassador, Lord Lothian, had to remind London at regular intervals, although 95% of Americans were anti-Hitler, this did not mean that 95% were pro-Ally. Indeed, as he wrote to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, on the 9th of December 1939, there are formidable elements within the United States which are definitely anti-British. The British were disliked for their empire, both on moral grounds, but also commercial grounds. In particular, the Americans and the Roosevelt administration, in particular the US Secretary of State Cordell Hull, detested the system of tariffs known as imperial preference, which protected British Empire trade. In those days, the United States was extremely anti-tariffs, and it was the British, with their empire in decline and their increasing loss of global commerce, that were trying to protect their stream of revenue. Britain's society seemed impossibly hidebound and class-conscious to American eyes, while the British ruling elite, be they their representatives abroad or their parliamentarians at home, seemed to many Americans to be insufferably supercilious and condescending. Most acute of all was the belief prevalent among isolationists that the British were trying to inveigle them into war, a belief which was supported by the popular notion that the British had somehow managed to hoodwink the US into joining the First World War. In the winter of 1939-1940, a huge poster campaign was launched across the Midwest of America, which proclaimed in bold letters, "Beware the British serpent. Once more a boa constrictor, perfidious Albion is crawling across the American landscape, spewing forth its unctuous lies." And just to give you an indication of how isolationist, really well-educated, senior, responsible Americans could be, I will just give you this anecdote, which I found in the papers of the Australian minister to Washington, a man called Richard Casey, who challenged one of the leading isolationist senators, Arthur Vandenberg, over a dinner just after the surrender of France. And he challenged him by asking how Vandenberg saw the world following a German victory. Vandenberg replied that it would be unpleasant, but not catastrophic. The population of the British Isles, he replied, could always be transferred to Canada. And if you look at the opinion polls, and I was very struck by this during my research, Britain consistently, apart from a few months during the Battle of Britain and thereafter when Britain stood alone, ranked around 6th of the list of countries that Americans said they had greatest sympathy with. Ahead of Britain were Czechoslovakia, annexed by Germany in March of 1939, Poland, invaded by Germany in September of 1939, Finland, invaded by the Soviet Union in November of 1939, and France, invaded by Germany in May of 1940. And then once the Grand Alliance had been formed, the power which most Americans claimed they had sympathy with, according to opinion polls, was not a European power at all, but nationalist China. There was another reason for denying aid to the British beyond the fear that America was going to be increasingly drawn into a European conflict that was not her concern. And that was the fear that Britain was going to be defeated. Next slide, please. This was a fear overwhelmingly propagated by the dispatches, by the letters, and by the slander of the US ambassador to the Court of St. James's, Joseph P. Kennedy, father, as you all know, of the future president. I'm quite an admirer of President Kennedy, but I don't have much, I'm afraid to say, that is of a complimentary kind about his father, a man who, as the leading British diplomat in the Foreign Office said, viewed all questions of foreign policy from the perspective of his own share portfolio. He was an ignorant and bumptious ambassador, and also, I'm afraid to say, a coward. When his successor as American ambassador, John Gill Wynant, was the resident in Grosvenor Square in London, he would not evacuate the American embassy when the next door building was on fire because of an incendiary bomb. But during the Blitz, Joseph Kennedy would leave his staff in the embassy to drive to a villa that he had rented in Windsor to avoid the bombs. "There are signs of decay, if not decadence here," Kennedy cabled Roosevelt on the 30th of September 1939. "I'm afraid that I can't conceive of the results that this war will bring as running counter to the evolutionary process. England passed her peak as a world power some years ago and has been steadily on the decline." Later, as first the Battle of France, then the Battle of Britain raged, he sent, as I've mentioned, a string of increasingly hysterical messages to Washington, insisting that the mother country was licked and that the time had come for the Americans to cut ties and look to their own interests. It should also be acknowledged, however, that there was not much military aid that the US could give at the beginning of the war. In the spring of 1940, the United States had only the 18th largest army in the world, 225,000 men. That was an army smaller than Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and even Switzerland. There was only one tank brigade in the entire US Army, while the US Air Force possessed a mere 160 fighters and 52 heavy bombers. So it was extremely important for the British to show the Americans that they were going to survive and that any materiel the US administration was prepared to send to Britain was going to be used to fight the Germans, not end up in German hands. And here we come to one of the first examples in my book of one of the most important themes which runs throughout it, which is the tension between military expediency and military factors on the one hand, and politics on the other. What is the relationship between the two of them is what is driving a huge amount of my analytical interest in here. What is leading to such and such a decision? Is it primarily a military decision, or is it a primarily political decision? Often it's both, but one tends to have greater primacy over the other. And we can see this, I think, in a really very significant action, but one which I fear and am surprised by does not receive the level of scrutiny and certainly the level of archival research that I believe it has deserved until now. And that is, next slide, please, an indication of the first British victory of the Second World War. This occurred on the 3rd of July, 1940, and was, as I'm sure you all know, not against the Germans, not against the Italians, but against the French. This was when the Royal Navy, opened fire on the force de raid, a significant proportion of the French Navy off the coast of North Africa, off the port of Mers el Kabir, if we're being precise. Now, there were, of course, very significant military reasons for this action, an action which could have been avoided very easily had the French admiral on the spot, Admiral Gensoul, or the French commander-in-chief, Admiral Darlan, both bitter Anglophobes. Darlan would later be premier of the Vichy state, but nevertheless, they were offered terms which would have allowed them to maintain their navy and sail it to French ports in the West Indies, to Canada, to America, to sail it to British ports, or to scuttle the ships themselves. It was only their refusal to accept any of these entirely honourable and indeed viable alternatives that caused the British to open fire, thus killing some 1,300 French sailors. The military justification is obvious. Britain was facing the threat of invasion, and the French had the fourth largest navy in the world. We think of the summer of 1940 as belonging to the few, the pilots that flew the Spitfires and the Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain, but that was the first line of defense. The second and critical line of defense was the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy massively outstripped the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, in 1940, but it was also itself highly stretched, guarding the sea lanes of the Atlantic, trying to ward off the Japanese in the Far East, heading through the Suez Canal, and also defending the Channel against a prospective invasion. If the French Navy, the fourth largest in the world, fell into German hands, then the entire strategic calculus for a successful invasion was going to change. And while the French gave assurances that they would never surrender their navy, they had also broken their word in various important respects to the British, most critically on the question of suing for a separate peace. The British and the French had signed an agreement in March of 1940 prohibiting either party to sign a separate armistice. And then when the British released the French from this armistice, they made it a condition of doing so that the French Navy sail to British ports. So I think in the summer of 1940, the British have absolutely no reason to trust the newly minted Vichy regime collaborating with Hitler, and every reason to distrust it. But then there are also political reasons, the ones which I have mentioned already, the overwhelming desire to show the world in general, to show the British people in general, and particularly to show America that Britain was not going to go the way of France, that Britain was going to fight on no matter what. It wasn't just a question of fighting to our last breath. We were prepared to act on the very fringes of morality. We were prepared to do anything, even something as ruthless as shelling the navy of a nation which, until 2 weeks earlier, had been our ally. And if there is one document that I can say I got extremely excited about finding in the course of my research, it is a one-line telegram from the British ambassador, Lord Lothian, to Franklin Roosevelt the day after the bombardment at Mers el Kabir. And it simply read, "You will see that Winston Churchill has taken the action in regard to the French fleet, which we discussed and you approved." And before that, nobody had even suggested that the British had hinted to the Americans that they were contemplating this action, let alone asked the White House's permission to do so. So I think that is a significant document, and one which shows how politics, and indeed particularly the desire to always think, how is this going to play in America? How is this going to play in the White House? How is this going to play with Republicans in Congress? And although we don't really have time to get into it right now, I'd be happy to talk about it in questions. The decision to send a British expeditionary force to Greece in the spring of 1941 was also to a large extent predicated on the idea that this would play well with America, and that failure to aid the Greeks in their coming battle against the Germans would play very badly in America. And it is therefore an overwhelmingly political decision that is justified politically, but leads to what many British strategists had forecast, which is a complete disaster and another evacuation. Next slide, please. From the autumn of 1940, the British do receive an increasing amount of aid from the United States. It is, however, not a free gift, and there is an enormous amount of very complicated and quite bitter politics, which I've spent a lot of time delving into, as to how aid was prized out of the hands of a reluctant White House and a reluctant Congress, and the bargain that the benefactor, that is the US, gave to the supplicant. So in order to obtain 50 antiquated destroyers, the British, as I'm sure you know, had to grant the US 99-year leases for air and naval bases on British possessions in the Caribbean and off the coast of Canada. These were, in total, FDR told Congress, the greatest addition to the defense of the United States since the Louisiana Purchase. And there is no possibility of trying to say that there's any degree of equality between the destroyers themselves and the strategic value of the territory that the British gave up. But the British were desperate, and so this deal was made. Similarly, up until March 1941, when Congress agreed to lend the beleaguered empire the tools to, if not finish the job, as Churchill said, at least to hold off the Axis until other allies could be found, the British were forced to pay in dollars or in gold for all of their war purchases. And on the 10th of January 1941, a US cruiser arrived off the coast of South Africa to carry away 42 million pounds worth of Britain's last remaining gold reserves, an action which Churchill likened to a sheriff collecting the last assets of a helpless debtor. He wrote this in a telegram, which he wished to send to Roosevelt, protesting the move, but then decided not to send it in one of his draft telegrams. Similarly, the US Treasury under the not entirely pro-British Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. insisted that Britain liquidate her most valuable direct investments, that is to say, British companies in the US. And the most significant of these was Visco, a textile giant, which American competitors had wanted to get their hands on for many, many years, was sold in a fire sale for a fraction of its actual value. And while American Wall Street bankers made a significant profit on the transaction, the British Treasury had to bail out the British shareholders. This is not to say that Lend-Lease was not absolutely essential to victory. It is merely to say that this was not, as Winston Churchill later said when speaking about it in the House of Commons, the most unsordid act in history. Lend-Lease to Britain was lent, and the debt was only completed, entirely repaid, in 2006. It was also not true to say that this was being lent to the British to fight a war which was of no concern to the United States. This was a war of great concern to the US, as Roosevelt and other members of both senior Democrats and Republicans realized, and the British and the British Commonwealth were paying for it with their blood as well as with their treasure. But the $50 billion worth of American aid, which left the United States between March 1941 and September 1945, was utterly critical to Allied victory, as were the $8 billion of aid which the British Empire supplied to the US in reciprocal aid. Next slide, please. I've dealt on some of the disagreements and differences in the early stages of the Anglo-American relationship, merely because I think these have not received enough attention. But we should not, while doing this, lose sight of some absolute fundamentals, which is that the Anglo-American alliance, the Anglo-American military alliance, the Anglo-American Soviet alliance was not really a military alliance. The British and the Americans supplied the Soviets with a huge amount of material with which the Soviet Union could not have survived, but there was no major coordination of plans and no joint operations between the Western democracies and the Red Army. The military alliance was an Anglo-American affair, and it was the most sophisticated, most integrated, most collegiate political military alliance in history. And it succeeded despite a multitude of disagreements and strategic errors in ridding the Axis from North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Western Europe, while simultaneously laying the foundations for the post-war order. So I think these are major achievements, and I don't believe that we should ever lose sight of them, and I hope that I don't, and believe that I don't, in my book. And it is also important to say that there was a genuine friendship between Roosevelt and Churchill, but this is not a linear friendship. This is a friendship which I think peaks in the winter of 1942 to 1943, and thereafter deteriorates, not entirely, but gradually declines as Roosevelt seeks to carve out his own relationship with Stalin at the expense of Churchill and at the expense of the British. I think FDR is the most fascinating of all the Allied war leaders that I write about in my book, because he is the most contrary, the most puzzling, the most enigmatic. I really do believe that almost everything that you can say about Franklin Roosevelt, you can also say the exact opposite. Ostensibly warm and straightforward, he was also cold and manipulative. A consummate politician capable of all the requisite cynicism, he was at the same time one of the great idealists of the 20th century. Frivolous, yet earnest, patient, though easily bored, he combined the shibboleths of American egalitarianism with, frankly, a fetish for European royalty, while his efforts on behalf of the destitute and suffering went hand in hand with an unshakable sense of himself as a patrician and an attitude towards those around and beneath him that could, on occasion, stray into the cruel. A president of paradoxes, therefore, the one feature both allies and opponents agreed on was his addiction to obfuscation and dissemblance. Roosevelt and Churchill disagreed on many subjects, but to list them in only their most rudimentary form, they would be on grand strategy, in particular the timing of the reinvasion of Western Europe, imperialism and the future of the British Empire, the financing of the war effort, and in particular the financing of the British war effort, their attitudes to the Free French, General de Gaulle, and to Vichy France. The United States government continued to recognize the collaborationist regime of Marshal Pétain until it was dissolved by the Germans in November of 1942. And finally, the two men came increasingly to disagree about the threat posed by Stalin and the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. I'm aware I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over a bit of my early talk about Allied relations with the Soviets and move towards Churchill and Roosevelt's dealings with Stalin. So next slide again, please. I think that neither Churchill nor Roosevelt were at their best when dealing with Stalin. The best that can be said of Churchill is that he oscillated between rarely justified optimism, generally occasioned by when Stalin was being cooperative, when Stalin was being friendly, when Stalin had sent him a warm telegram or had a good meeting with him, to acute pessimism about the state of the future of Europe and the intentions of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis Bolshevizing all territory that they could get their hands on. Roosevelt, even more than Churchill, believed he could handle Stalin. He puts this in a telegram to Churchill of the summer of 1942. I believe I can handle Stalin better than either you or your Foreign Office or my State Department. And later, when he is in conversation, next slide, please, with his first ambassador to Washington, sorry, his first ambassador to Moscow, William C. Bullitt, he tells him that he has, and I quote, just a hunch that Stalin doesn't want anything but security for his country. Bullitt, who had served in Moscow between 1933 and 1936 and had seen Stalinism in force during the show trials and early purges, responded that Stalin was, and I quote again, a Caucasian bandit whose only thought when he got something for nothing was that the other fellow was an ass. Next slide, please. But Roosevelt had never met somebody he couldn't win over before or ignore or circumvent. And I think he genuinely believed that the war would end, that the Soviet Union would be destitute, that they would need American financial assistance, and that he would be able to manipulate the global chess pieces as he wished at some great final conference such as had existed at Versailles at the end of the First World War. Of course, he died, and such a conference was never held. But it was, I'm afraid, naive in the extreme to believe that the Red Army or Stalin could be cajoled to give up territory which they had already conquered as a result of the general strategic offensive in the East. And I think it is particularly striking that while from at least 1943, if not from 1941, the British and the Soviets are putting politics in relation to Europe as at the forefront of their agenda, or certainly on an equal footing with military strategy. Roosevelt continues to prioritize military strategy above politics, even up to and including at the Yalta Conference. His overwhelming priority at that conference is to ensure that Stalin signs up to joining the war against Japan, which Stalin does. One source of optimism in the West, and in the White House in particular, about cooperating with Stalin is the idea that he had stopped being a revolutionary Bolshevik bent on the overthrow of global capitalism through the course of the war, and had become and I quote, mere Russian nationalist. And Stalin gave a certain amount of credence to this by putting on a military uniform rather than the peasant smock he used to wear, and taking down the pictures of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin in his office, and putting up the portraits of old Russian heroes like Marshal Kutuzov, the man who had driven Napoleon out of Russia in 1812. William Bullitt, who had already said that Stalin was a Caucasian bandit whose only thought when he got something for nothing was that the other fellow was an ass, had no truck with this thesis whatsoever, and so disturbed was he by Roosevelt's attitude towards Stalin that he wrote him an extraordinarily clear-sighted 3-page memorandum, which he sent him in 1943. And I think I will conclude my remarks by quoting a paragraph from this dispatch, because I think what he says is as true then as it is today, or rather I should say is as true today as it was then. The wishful thinkers, wrote Bullitt, forget conveniently that the Russian nationalist state was never pacific. Tsarist Russia was, and the Soviet Union today is, an agglomeration of conquered peoples. Since the time of Peter the Great, the Russians have extended their rule ruthlessly over one people after another. Primary school books in the Soviet Union are issued in 156 different languages and dialects. The Russians are an immensely endowed people, physically strong, intellectually gifted, emotionally rich. The Ukrainians are even more gifted than the Russians. They were overcome by the Russians by force of numbers. Even if Stalin had become a mere Russian nationalist, which he has not, that would be no guarantee of pacific behavior. Indeed, it would be a guarantee of aggressive imperialism. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Tim. That was a great talk. Very fascinating. I see we've already got a few questions in the queue. I'll go from there. Cornelia asked, did the alliance also depend on deference? For example, the U.S. Churchill demands.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Did the alliance also depend on deference, particularly the U.S. deferring to Churchill's demands? How? Could you talk a little bit more about that relationship?
Sure. Well, no, there was certainly no deference from the US regarding Britain's status. The US understood that Britain was desperate and the US was safe from the bombs which were raining down on the old world, and the US had all the gold and all the cash and increasingly the industry and increasingly the armaments to win the war. Nevertheless, Roosevelt did defer to Churchill's views on grand strategy for the early years of their collaboration. And there were two major reasons for this. One, the American president realized that Churchill had made strategy and military affairs a major area of interest in a way that they hadn't been for Roosevelt. Churchill had very strong ideas on how the war should be fought and in what way. And Roosevelt was happy to go along with these ideas because simply for lack of a suitable alternative of his own in the early stages of their relationship. But that changes around the Tehran Conference of November 1943, when the big three meet together. But secondly, because actually until the month after D-Day, British and British Commonwealth forces, British and British Commonwealth tanks, and British and British Commonwealth shipping was responsible for the preponderance of the Western effort. So if, as indeed did happen, the Americans tried to suggest that their task should be to reinvade France in 1942 or 1943, the British could veto this because it relied overwhelmingly on British resources at that time. Whereas as we move on, it's the United States that has the muscle and is able to call the shots. But no, deference didn't play a great role. If anything, if we look at the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, certainly in manner, it is Churchill that it defers to Roosevelt. He always called him Mr. President, except once at the Yalta Conference when Roosevelt said he was going to leave after only 5 days. And he said, Franklin, you can't do this. But Roosevelt always called Churchill Winston or Winnie.
Yeah, and I know they both had naval commands in their background, which probably potentially helped. A few more in the Q&A, and then Mike will get to you. Steve asks, I've read that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American military wished to shut down Lend-Lease and aid to Russia and keep all military equipment for the U.S. military, and that this was of great concern to Churchill. Could you comment on this?
You're completely correct. It was a huge concern. Some ships which were on the high seas were turned around, and others which were being loaded with material for the British and for the Russians were promptly unloaded. And one of the major reasons why Churchill invites himself to the White House, the first White House summit he has with Roosevelt, is not just to try and impose his view on grand strategy, it is to prevent British, prevent the Americans from taking all of their promised resources and deploying them purely in their own sphere of operations, which at that stage was just against the Japanese. There's a 5-day hiatus between Pearl Harbor and Hitler declaring war on America. So Churchill is hugely concerned about this, and one must give Roosevelt great credit to say that he absolutely rose to the global and allied sense of dimension about the war at that time. He was not going to throw everything into the Pacific. He stuck to the Germany first strategy, the Europe first strategy, which had been agreed between British and American strategists a year earlier. And he ensured that British forces and British Commonwealth forces continued to receive material, including, most critically, a large number of tanks, which he sent to North Africa after the British had surrendered at Tobruk in the summer of 1942.
Okay, a few more in the queue here. Brandon writes, congratulations on discovering the communications which showed the U.S. was aware ahead of a time that Mir's el-Kabir was in the offing. My question is whether we ought to regard the Grand Alliance as a reality. Certainly, U.S. and U.K. military operations were thoroughly integrated, but the Russian war occurred in parallel without any real coordination, despite Lend-Lease operations. Can you think of any military operation between the Russians and the U.S. or U.K. that was well integrated?
I can't think of any major operation. Stalin promised a major offensive in the East 1 month after D-Day, and there was a Soviet offensive in the East, not maybe a month, I think it might have been 6 weeks after D-Day to keep up maximum pressure on the Germans. But no, it was, you're doing your bit in this theatre, we will do our bit in our theatre, and in the meantime, we will supply you with a huge, huge amount of equipment, which even Stalin, and certainly Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet commander-in-chief, acknowledged was utterly essential to Russia's survival in the war. The trucks which transported the Red Army from Stalingrad to Berlin were American-made. The Spam, which stopped the Red Army from starving, was canned in Minnesota.
A few questions on Churchill's relationship with Stalin. I think you
Hmm.
touched could you talk a little more, particularly as it relates to FDR's view? Obviously, they saw Stalin differently.
Churchill is a hugely emotional creature, and this can cloud his judgment, but it also makes him an endearing figure to historians. Stalin could have a certain roguish charm, and he knew how to play on people's vanity. And Churchill had was vain, just as most senior politicians are vain, just as most humans are vain. And when he had good meetings with Stalin, he would say, "I like him." And when the war was over and the Cold War was very much on the horizon, he said, "If only I could have a meeting with Stalin once a month, we could iron this all out." So the sort of thing that the current US president says about the Russian president. Similarly, when Churchill returned from the Yalta conference, he told a small group of his cabinet colleagues, he said, "Poor Neville Chamberlain thought he could trust Hitler, but I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin." Absolutely devastating quotation. But he had said 2 months earlier, "There's nothing I can do to stop the whole of Eastern Europe from being Bolshevized." And there are even more quotations that suggest that he understood what was happening. The big There are many failures which I think Churchill and Roosevelt made towards Stalin, but one of the fundamental ones is they did not understand the nature of the Soviet dictatorship. Stalin played them at meeting after meeting after meeting. They would tend to have three meetings, and in the first meeting, he was vaguely reasonable. In the second meeting, he was utterly obstreperous and uh, difficult and threatened to break the alliance, threatened separate pieces, goaded his allies. The talks almost always completely broke down. And then there was détente on the third meeting. And this was a standard negotiating technique. But the British and the Americans, when they left after the second meeting, and tried to rationalize how Stalin could be so different on day one to day two, always came up with the same answer, which was totally ridiculous, which was that Stalin is not as powerful as we thought. He's gone back, he's spoken to his colleagues in the Politburo, and they've said, "You've not fought hard enough for Soviet interests. This isn't good enough. You must go out there and fight harder." And so they genuinely seem to think that there were shadowy powers behind the throne, whereas any journalistic observer of Soviet Russia, let alone the diplomatic experts, knew that Stalin was even more of a one-man dictator than Adolf Hitler was.
I'll take one more from Gary and then go to Mike. Gary writes, one of the interesting aspects of your book is the speculation, which I found convincing, that there was a connection between the Katyn forest discovery and the dissolution of the Comintern, the timing of which always puzzled me. Around the same time, however, there was Stalin's extreme displeasure about the delay in opening up the Second Front and the rumor back channel talks between Germany and the Soviet Union. There seems to be a contradiction between Stalin's initiatives at this time. Could you please comment?
Could you repeat the line broke up? I got the Katyn and the Comintern. Could you just repeat the latter part of it?
Around the same time, however, there was Stalin's extreme displeasure about the delay in opening up the Second Front and the rumored back-channel talks between Germany and the Soviet Union. There seems to be a contradiction between Stalin's initiatives at this time. Could you please comment?
I think that that is entirely fair, and we do not have documentary evidence to prove it one way or the other. I think that the threat of a separate peace was almost always a threat, and I think that its lack of potential to be carried out is something that the British and the Americans should have weighed much more heavily. For instance, I'm just putting it simply, when the Germans were winning the war on the Eastern Front, Hitler had no reason to agree to a separate peace. And when Stalin was winning the war on the Eastern Front, he had no reason to uh, make a separate peace. So I think the British and the Americans could have taken Stalin's threats with more of a pinch of salt. Stalin was deeply, deeply annoyed by the democracies for not opening a second front as they had promised to. And yet, as Molotov as Molotov confessed in retirement, this was also a stick with which to beat the Western powers to extract more material, more bombing, other forms of, or to use leverage to get them to recognize Soviet conquests and Soviet sovereignty over areas such as the Baltic states and Eastern Poland. I don't think it is. Stalin is very wily, and I don't think it is necessarily a contradiction to dissolve the Comintern and to berate the West about their failure to open up a second front, for the simple reason that the dissolution of the Comintern was not seen in the Soviet Union as significant at all. Dmitrov continued to be in touch with communist parties and communist resistance movements across Europe. The apparatus was still there. It was swiftly reestablished as the links were even more swiftly reestablished as the Red Army swept westwards. And it was more a signal to potential resistors across Europe that it was more important to fight on a national basis and that the people would support them more on a national basis. It's a huge admission of the failure of Marxist-Leninist ideology to inspire people. He got furious with the Yugoslav partisans when they had red stars on their caps. He said, don't do that. You're not meant to be a Bolshevik movement. You're meant to be a people's liberation movement. These people, that's how you're going to get people to fight the Germans. And that's what Stalin did himself in Russia when he broadcast. He didn't talk about the struggle for Marxism, Leninism, the struggle for socialist utopia. He talked about Mother Russia and all the other traits of traditional Russian nationalist patriotism were invoked by him and the regime. It's a staggering admission of failure of the appeal of his own political ideology to have to revert to national types. So I don't think that it's necessarily contradictory to be as anti the Western strategy of delaying the second front on the one hand and dissolving the Comintern on the other, particularly when he was under great international pressure and scrutiny due to the Katyn discovery.
Great. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Wonderful talk. My compliments. And I was wondering, going by Churchill's quote, the Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility. Is it possible that when I have two questions actually. So the first question is it possible that Churchill's remark about the unsortedness of the American action had much more to do with the unsortedness of the loan that was made to Britain? It wasn't a gift; it was a loan. That the conditions of the loan that was done, it was, after all, known as Lend-Lease. If that was possibly what he was referring to. And as far as Stalin goes, I was wondering to what degree Stalin had already proven to be somewhat duplicitous, pretty evidently somewhat duplicitous almost from the get-go. So to what degree was it perceived as a problem with the Soviet state or Soviet communism, as opposed to the person of Stalin himself? And also, if I can throw in, how did Truman differ from Roosevelt in his ideas towards Stalin?
Fantastic questions, Mike. Thank you. The Unsorted Act, there was no financial loan there was no money exchange. This was trying to avoid the problem. Lend-Lease came about because it was trying to avoid the problem which had occurred in the First World War, where the US did give a huge amount of financial credit to support the British war effort, and then the British never repaid the war debts, which is another reason why there was a huge amount of disquiet in America about the British in the interwar years and even into the Second World War itself. The most unsordid act in history, yes, it seemed like this was the beginning of the great arsenal of democracy, and what a great testament to how the Anglo-American alliance played out during the war was that disagreements that occurred between allies always occurred in private, or almost always occurred. There are very few instances of the Allied leaders airing their views, unless they are positive views about each other publicly. And of course, Lend-Lease wasn't all Churchill wanted from the United States. He wanted, indeed, he needed American belligerence. And so the courtship of the United States continued, and it continued throughout the war, because then not only was America utterly essential to the war and essential to victory, but America would be essential to Britain's solvency thereafter. On Truman and his attitude to Stalin, Truman, as a senator, was on record as saying that if the Germans were winning the war in the East, this was after Barbarossa had been going for about 2 months, then the Allies and the Americans ought to aid the Soviets. But if the Soviets were winning the war in the East, then they ought to aid the Germans. The point being, he said, it would be excellent if these two deeply sinister totalitarian regimes and expansionist powers could weaken each other or strangle each other to death in the mud and freezing wastes of Eastern Europe and Russia. So he came to the presidency with a deep anti-Soviet feeling, and I don't think he in any way was swept up with the pro-Soviet tide of public opinion that occurred in Britain and the US following the victories at Moscow and Stalingrad. And then he wanted to show that he could be a tough and decisive leader. He had had no foreign policy experience before, and he obviously became president at an absolutely critical time, and Averell Harriman, the US ambassador to Moscow, flew back to Washington, specially to brief him on how the Soviets were, in his view, violating the Yalta Accords, and Truman gave Molotov a piece of his mind in the Oval Room, as it was then known, not the Oval Office. And if you believe Truman's memoirs, I think they're a little embellished in this exchange. Molotov replied, "I've never been spoken to like this in my life." And Truman is alleged to have replied, "Carry out your agreements and you won't get spoken to like that." He hadn't made the final decision not to collaborate with the Russians, and he came away from Potsdam with a highly favorable view of Stalin. But thereafter, there isn't collaboration against Hitler, which is what had kept the alliance together beforehand, whereas there are multiple Soviet actions which cause alarm in the West and disapprobation. So I think even FDR would have been forced to come to a far more realistic view of Stalin and his actions, which brings me to your middle question, which was about to what extent was it considered a problem with Stalin, and to what extent was it considered a problem of Soviet communism? In the main, it was considered a problem with Soviet communism. Stalin was a problem because he was a very tough, very intelligent negotiator, a man who said very little at Allied conferences, was the embodiment of the Teddy Roosevelt adage about saying little and carrying, in his case, a very, very big stick indeed. He was tough, he was ruthless, and he very seldom compromised. But the problem was not so much just the fact that this was an expansionist ideology, but also that Russian insecurity, which predated the 1917 revolution and exists right up to the present day and is being manifested in Ukraine, has always believed that these borders need to be expanded because they are not of a highly natural character, in the sense that they're not defined by geographical features, to be expanded further and further outwards for the security and prestige of the Russian Empire. And we come back to the 156 different languages and all of that. And as Averil Harriman wrote in a dispatch of 1944, it becomes a very dangerous logic. The logic of the situation is, if you accept that Russia must be allowed to dominate her immediate neighbors in the name of security, then surely it follows that she must be allowed to then dominate at a later date the next most immediate neighbors, and so on and so on. That was an aspect of Russian foreign policy, which, as I say, predated the 1917 revolution, and which Soviet experts like Harriman, like George Kennan, like William C. Bullitt appreciated, but which I'm afraid Franklin Roosevelt and Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, did not, or certainly not to the extent that was necessary.
Great. Thanks for the question, Mike. And Tim, I think that's a great place to end the talk. Thank you very much for your time. Again, the book is Allies at War, How the Struggles Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War and the World. Wonderful book. And I think, Tim, it looks like you're going to be here in New York at some point in the next few weeks.
Yes.
Please join us.
I will be. I'm speaking. If anyone is a member, or if anyone isn't a member, I can get you in as a guest. And if they wanted to get my email from Gregory, I'm speaking at the Colony Club in New York the last week of October, the Brennan Center of Justice, the Racket and Tennis Club, and the Salmagundi Club. There's my New York itinerary before I go on to Philadelphia and Boston and elsewhere.
Oh, wonderful. I'm sure a few of our audience will be able to make those talks. Thank you again, Tim. And then this Tuesday evening, October 21st at 8 p.m., we welcome David Winkler to discuss his book, The Mighty A, The Short Heroic Life of the USS Atlanta, America's First Warship Commission after Pearl Harbor, which claims to be the first comprehensive account of Atlanta's war, and it covers the construction, commissioning, and the full war service. We've had David before, wonderful speaker, so hopefully you can join us. Until then, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at our next talk. Tim, personal thank you, and best of luck with the New York tour. I'm sure you'll be well received. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.